Öğle aramıza geçmeden önce bir sunumumuz daha olacak. Sovrin Vakfı Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı, aynı zamanda İngiltere Brigham Young Üniversitesi'nin kurumsal mimarı. 2005 yılında da Internet Identity Workshop etkinliğini kurdu ve tam 28 kez bu etkinliği düzenledi. Aynı zamanda kendisi bir yazar. Sayın Phillip Windley'i sahneye davet ediyorum alkışlarınızla. I would like to invite Chair at Sovrin Foundation, Mr. Phillip Windley.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I want to talk today about the idea of lifelike identity. So imagine that my clicker worked. There we go. As was mentioned, I'm the chair of the Sovrin Foundation, a nonprofit that is building an identity meta system. And I want to talk to you about what that means and why that idea is important. So imagine that you go out to dinner with friends to a restaurant. And what you're trying to do is to just have a good time. You find the restaurant. You're able to talk to the host and get a table. You see your friend. You're able to engage in a conversation. You talk to the waiter. You order food. The food comes. You continue talking. Eventually, the dinner's over. You pay. All of these activities require that you recognize, remember, and interact with people, places, things, organizations, and you do this without any thought of identity. You don't ever think, oh, what identity system am I using to have this conversation with my friend? If you can imagine this same restaurant situation, mediated by today's digital devices and identity systems, you can start to get a feel for how unnatural our current situation is online. You'd show up at the restaurant. First of all, you'd have to install some app to even find the restaurant. Once you found the restaurant, you may not recognize the host until you had logged in. You can't find your friend, and then you realize it's because they use iOS and you use Android, and you've got to install a special app just to be able to see your friend at the restaurant. And once you do that, you want to have a conversation over the table, but you have to install the restaurant's application for conversation and log in to the restaurant system in order to talk. That's how ridiculous our digital lives are. What I want to propose is that we are building digital identity systems. We're trying to build new ways of digital identity systems that will create natural, lifelike interactions online that are similar to the ones that we have offline. That's a tall order. It's not just making authentication a little better or getting rid of usernames and passwords. It's about completely reordering how digital identity happens online. Seems to be a delay. There we go. How did we get into this mess? Everybody knows the internet was built without an identity layer. Right? And so, as a result, what we have is everybody building their own identity system in order to recognize, remember, and interact with people, places, and things online. So you've probably seen this cartoon. It's one of the most famous cartoons online. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. I run, along with Kalia Hamlin and Doc Searles, the Internet Identity Workshop. We adopted that motif as the logo for the workshop. We will have our 29th Internet Identity Workshop next week in Mountain View, California, we have come together 29 times to talk about digital identity, user-centric identity. And despite all of the progress that has happened over the years, there's still no way to prove that you're not a dog online, or to prove what your address is, or that you're over 18, or numerous other things that we want to be able to do in order to have lifelike interactions. This is Kim Cameron. Kim Cameron retired last month as Microsoft's chief identity architect. In 2005, he published a paper called The Laws of Identity. I'd recommend that you download it and read it. In that paper, Kim goes over 7 laws that he thinks digital identity systems ought to follow. But what caught my eye was that Kim talks about something he called an identity metasystem. Let's go. An identity metasystem. Kim says an identity metasystem has an encapsulating protocol, a unified user experience. Users can select among appropriate identity providers and features, and that it's not a monolith. It's not provided by a single organization, but instead has multiple players in an ecosystem. Kim talked about this in 2005. I have to admit, when Kim talked about this idea, I didn't understand the significance of it. I'm only now beginning to see how important what Kim was talking about is. What's a metasystem? Well, you all are very familiar with a metasystem now. The internet is a communications metasystem. The internet isn't a communications system with a single way of doing something, like a phone. The internet is a metasystem upon which we can build all kinds of communication systems. So not only do we have email, but we also have messaging, and we have voice over IP, and all kinds of other applications for this universal communications metasystem that the internet represents. Why do we build identity systems? As I've already said, we build identity systems in order to recognize, remember, and interact with people, places, organizations, and things. Okay? That has to happen in with some level of trust. So when you log into Google, for example, what you're doing is you're trying to convince Google to trust that the person at the other end of this connection is the same person who created that account. That's it. That's all Google's asking. And that's not very much, right? It turns out that this is what we think is digital identity, but it's so little compared to all of the things that we use identity for every day in our physical interactions. Now, this is how we think of identity systems. Amazon builds an identity system. And I'm not picking on Amazon. You know, this is true of millions of other organizations. And we're all in the Amazon system. We call these administrative identity systems because Amazon is administering this system for their own purposes, with their own rules. They can kick you off at any time. So you don't really have an identity at Amazon. What you've got is an account in their system. And it's up to them what you can do with it and how that gets used. The problem, of course, is that there are millions of these, right? We're all in hundreds of them. And they all act slightly differently, right? So there's no unified user experience. They're all very narrow, right? They're shallow. There's thousands of identity systems, but they're all essentially asking the same thing. Can I authenticate this user with a username and password? And what is their self-reported name and maybe phone number and email, a few other attributes? They're all the same and all different. So think about how this works when you interact in the physical world. Now, I'm not very familiar with how Turkey's healthcare system works, so I hope it works similarly, right? Let's say you go into the pharmacy and you need to pick up a prescription that your doctor has given you. And in order to pick up the prescription, the pharmacist needs to know that you're over 18. What do? In the U.S., at least, we pull out a driver's license. Now you may say, what? You pull out a driver's license? Yeah, the U.S. has no national ID card, and so we use our driver's licenses as ID cards. The pharmacist looks at this driver's license, and they establish that you're over 18. Why does this work? This works because we trust the driver's license division to do a reasonably good job of identity proofing, right? Of establishing that you really are over 18, or what your birthday is. It also works because the driver's license division does a great job of packaging that up in a nice, easy-to-carry format. It's relatively tamper-evident. It has a sophisticated biometric device in it called a pitcher. And the pharmacist can look at the pitcher, look at you, see that that really is you, look at the date, figure out that you're over 18, and we go on. Note that the pharmacy does not have any technical integration with the driver's license division. They don't have any formal agreement with the driver's license division. There is no There's absolutely no business arrangement between the driver's license division and the pharmacy, and yet it works. Excuse me. I used to be the CIO for the state of Utah in the United States. The driver's license division did not believe that they were creating an identity system so that you could pick up your prescription at the pharmacy. That wasn't their job, and yet it works. So in the physical world, we do this all the time, right? We have all kinds of things that we think of as credentials. Now, the obvious use case for credential is a thing like a passport. But there are also driver's licenses and employee cards and membership cards and credit cards and report cards and transcripts and even boarding passes. Now, what I've done is I've gone from something that we all kind of think of as a credential all of the time, like a passport, to something that you may not have ever really considered as a credential. And even a receipt at a store or a cafe is a kind of credential. The receipt says you bought certain things at a certain place, at a certain time, often with a certain payment instrument. And it's certifying that those things are true, at least to anyone who believes the receipt. So if you need to go back and complain about poor service or prove to your company that you had a certain expense at dinner or whatever, we use a receipt, called a credential called a receipt. So in the physical world, identity works in a multi-source way, meaning that you have hundreds, maybe thousands of different credentials that you use at various times in order to prove things about yourself. Some of these are important, and you carry them around with you all the time, like your ID card and your credit cards. Some of them are important, and you keep them in a filing cabinet at home or a safe deposit bank at a bank. Some of them are temporary, like a receipt, where it's only important for a little while, or a boarding pass, where once you're on the flight, you don't care about it. Nevertheless, we do all of these things using a credentialing system. So my thesis today is that in order to support lifelike identity, in order to support the kind of identity interactions we have in the physical world, we need to bring some of the patterns from the physical world into the digital world through digital credentials. So, online, identity doesn't work in this same way. In fact, what we have online is the system that we've been talking about. Offline, we have this rich credentialing system that we're able to use. Note that we can use it in ad hoc interactions. Okay? I don't have to plan ahead of time that I'm going to go to the pharmacy and pick up a prescription and get a special kind of identifier for that. I just do it. I don't have to have any kind, like I mentioned, the pharmacy doesn't have to have any integration with the ID system, right? It just works. That's the same kind of thing we want. So what we want to be able to do is this kind of interaction. So suppose that my employer gives me an employee credential. And I want to and I have this employee credential. They give it to me, but it's not in some system that they manage, although they will have a system that they manage that keeps track of me. The credential isn't in it. The credential is something they give to me. I can take that credential to the bank and prove to the bank that I have a certain salary and I've been employed for a certain length of time in order to get a loan. And all of this happens without any kind of formal integration or relationship between the bank and my employer. This is the kind of interaction we want to have. Yeah. So when we do this kind of check, we have 4 things that the verifier, the bank, in this example I just gave, wants to do. First of all, the bank wants to know who issued the credential, my employer in this case. The bank wants to know who was the credential issued to, me. The bank wants to know, has the credential been tampered with? And finally, the bank wants to know, has the credential been revoked? We need to be able to establish all of these facts without the bank having to talk to the employer. So that's part of the design goal we have here. So this is a decentralized identity system. The reason it's a decentralized identity system is because the issuer gets to decide what credentials they will issue. No one's telling them that there's a specific credential. Your employer, your bank, whoever, can issue any credential they want for any purpose. No one is telling the identity owner what credentials they have to get or what credentials they have to hold. Every person decides on their own what credentials are important to them, goes out and procures them, holds them, and uses them. And finally, the verifier knows or gets to decide what credentials they will believe. If my bank wants to believe my employer's credential, they can do that. If they want to disbelieve it, they can do that. Note that what we just got to was a kind of trust verification that isn't in the 4 checks I mentioned a minute ago. Does the bank trust my employer? That's not a cryptographic question. That's a human question, right? How could they establish that whether or not they trust my employer? They have the identifier from my employer, that whoever issued the credential. But how do they know whether they trust my employer? There could be lots of ways that this happens. They could know who the employer is because it's local. They could look the employer up online. Or the employer might be part of a credential verification system. One more. So we do this all the time in the physical world. Think about college transcripts or driving licenses or identification cards from your employer. All of these things, somebody has decided how it's governed, published rules about how that works, and that kind of framework, that system, represents a way that the bank can trust the employer in the example I've been giving. So I'm going to do a demo, show you a little bit about how this works. So I'll come over here and sit down. Okay. So what you're seeing on my screen is a browser on the left that has a demo in it, and my phone, right? So this is my phone on the right. So I'm going to launch this application called Connect Me. You can download this application in the App Store for Google and Android. It's an application from Evernym. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through at least part of this tutorial. So this tutorial has a number of pieces. First of all, we're going to pretend we're Alice, and Alice is going to she's going to sign up for college and graduate and get a transcript. So this is Alice's college, Faber College, and you'll notice that it has here, connect with my digital wallet. So when I click on that, what they give me is a QR code. And over here on my phone, I'm going to open up the QR code reader. I'm going to select it. And you'll see that it says, "Hi there, Faber College wants to connect with you." And I'm going to say, "Okay." I'm going to connect. Wants my face, a little biometrics to prove that. And now I'm connected with Faber College. Okay? And the only thing in there is just that I'm connected. You'll notice over here on the browser that it says, "Oh, thanks for connecting with us. You're going to love being at Faber College." So I say, "Okay." Right? And it says, "Oh, hey, Alice, it's time for graduation." So we just had a university education there in just a few short seconds. And because I'm graduating, Faber College wants to offer me a credential that represents my transcript. So I'm going to say, "Okay, I'd like that." They send the offer. Now, what's going to happen on my phone is you'll notice that I get an offer on my phone, right? And it says, "Here's the transcript we want to give you. The college name, the degree, the GPA. I'm a very good student. And my major is self-sovereign identity software engineering." And I'm going to say, "Accept that." So now, I have accepted the transcript, and it takes a little bit for the transcript to actually issue. And now it says it's there, so we can look at the credential. That's the same credential that they offered me. You'll notice that what I have now is I have a relationship with Faber College, and in my relationship with Faber College, I have a credential. Faber College could give me dozens of credentials if they wanted. I have just this one. So, looks like we've got a little connection problem here. Hopefully that works. Well, it's supposed to automatically go to the next thing, and it's not. So, the demo gods are not with me today, so unfortunately. Anyway, I don't know how to recover from that, so we'll just move on. Let's see if I go here. No, that's just going to restart the whole thing. So we won't go through all of that. We'll go back and start talking. But nevertheless, I hope you get a little bit of an idea about how this works. What Alice did was Alice started Alice created a relationship with Faber College. Faber College was able to give her a credential. If we'd been able to continue with the demo, what would have happened is you would have seen that Alice applied for a job. They wanted to see her credential, and I'd be able to use the credential that Alice got from Faber College to prove to her employer that she had a certain GPA, etc. Let's stop that so that we don't have to see that anymore. Okay. And then once Alice had her employment credentials, she did go to the bank and get a loan. So that's all. That's what the demo shows. Is it going? Well, let's see. See if we can make it work now. So how does all this work? How does this credentialing system happen? There are four important things that make it work. First thing is something called a decentralized identifier. I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more about the decentralized identifiers today. Decentralized identifiers, or DIDs, provide a way for us to link to the cryptographic keys that represent the relationship. In Sovrin, we create a different DID for every relationship. So Alice would have a DID for her bank, she would have a DID for her employer, she would have a DID for her school. With every person she's connected to, she could actually have hundreds of these. Second thing is verifiable credentials. These things we've been talking about. This way of providing trustworthy digital credentials online. The third thing is a system of peer-to-peer agents. So in the demo that I just did, you'll notice that there was the website that Faber College had. There was the wallet that Alice had. These things are agents, and they're talking to each other, peer-to-peer. There's no intermediary. There's no third party sitting in the middle of those interactions. Those interactions are actually enabled through the decentralized identifiers and the cryptographic keys that are associated with them. The last one. Last piece of this puzzle is a distributed ledger. Now, the distributed ledger is important, the blockchain, right? It's important, but not everything goes on there. In fact, none of Alice's credentials are on the ledger. None of Alice's personal information is on the ledger. None of Alice's DIDs are on the ledger. So what is on the ledger? The decentralized identifier for the issuer, the schema for the credential, the revocation registry so that we can revoke it, and finally, the credential definition that ties those all together. So when the bank gets a credential from Alice, they actually get a proof, a zero-knowledge proof of the information in the credential. When the bank gets that proof from Alice, it contains the credential identifier. They go look that up on the ledger, and once they have the credential definition from the ledger, they can see the identifier of who issued it. They can see the revocation registry and check that it hasn't been revoked. They can see the schema and see how the credential is structured. They get all of that off of the ledger. That's why they don't have to talk to the employer. So the bank doesn't have to talk to the employer because the ledger breaks that circuit. And that's a really important property because it provides a lot of privacy for people who are using credentials. You may not care if your employer knows that you're getting a loan at the bank, but you might. You probably don't necessarily want the government to get a notification every time you use your ID card to prove that you're old enough to drink. There are lots of reasons why we don't want to have this kind of linkage between credential presentation and the credential issuer. Now, all of this is arranged in a stack. The bottom layer, like we've been talking about, is this public blockchain and the DIDs that sit on top of it and allow for finding the public keys or looking the public keys up based on the DID. On top of that is this system of peer-to-peer agents. The peer-to-peer agents know how to talk to the ledger. They know how to talk to each other. They know how to exchange credentials. This is a very decentralized system because of the peer-to-peer nature of how interactions happen. We can think of these two layers as providing cryptographic trust, meaning it's these two layers that provide the secure connection that allow the bank to be able to verify who issued the credential, that it hasn't been tampered with, who it was issued to, that it hasn't been revoked. All of these kinds of checks happen cryptographically and are enabled by these layers. On top of this cryptographic trust layer is where the credential exchange actually happens, the one we've been talking about with this triangle. And then, in order to enable trust, between parties, you can imagine a set of rules that allow for governance of how this credential exchange happens. And there could be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of these sets of rules for different kinds of credential exchangings. That creates a different identity system for each context. We can think of this layer as being about human trust. Whether the bank trusts the employer or not, like I said before, is not a cryptographic question. Whether the bank trusts the employer is a human decision that the bank has to make based on their policies and their rules. Okay? Those things happen in this layer. Now, I'm going to advance the slide one more time. When you do, what's going to happen is the labels on the left-hand side of these layers are going to change. So you can see that this bottom layer is what I've been talking about as an identity metasystem. Meaning this is the universal, always on, always available, cryptographically based trust system that allows for credential exchange. On top of that, each individual credential exchange that happens represents a context-specific identity system. Like I said before, every issuer gets to decide what credentials they will issue, and every verifier gets to decide what credentials they'll accept. This is how we get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of different identity systems on top of a common identity metasystem. My proposition to you is that there's a single identity metasystem. That doesn't mean sovereign per se. That means a single protocol, a single set of rules for how this cryptographic trust is established. Think about it this way. We don't have industry-specific internets. We don't have industry-specific, we don't have regional internets. We don't have country-specific internets. We have an internet. Now, does that mean that they're all the same? No, there are different rules and different ways that that happens, but the protocols are the same. And the governance, things like domain names, for example, are universal. And that's what allows the internet to function as a metasystem. On top of that, are there industry, region, country-specific kinds of communication systems built on the internet? Absolutely. And there will be the same kinds of identity systems built on an identity metasystem. But having a universal protocol-based identity metasystem is critical for creating natural, lifelike identity. In the paper that I mentioned earlier, The Laws of Identity, Kim says this: as users, we need to see our various identities as part of an integrated world, which nonetheless respects our need for independent contexts. So there is this universal system, but with independent contexts. And one of the things that's important to talk about when we talk about an identity metasystem is privacy. In building a workable internet identity metasystem, we don't want to build the world's greatest surveillance system. Okay? We want to build a system that respects the kind of natural privacy that we have in the physical world. When you walk down the street, everybody doesn't know who you are. You don't have your name tattooed on your forehead. Right? You have a measure of anonymity. When you go into a shop and buy something, you don't have this kind of universal identification system that works. You have enough for the interaction at hand. Privacy can happen, and the system can still be useful and available. So how do we protect privacy? There are a couple of things that are important. I mentioned earlier that Sovrin creates a different digital identifier, or decentralized identifier, a DID, for every relationship that you have. So people will have thousands of these. Why do that? To prevent correlation. If the bank and the employer both had the same identifier for Alice, the bank and the employer would be able to talk about Alice behind her back using that identifier. That's correlation. Sovrin doesn't support that kind of correlation. And nevertheless, Alice can prove that the credential issued to her by her employer was really issued to her, to her bank. So Alice is providing correlation at the time of need. So Alice is correlating the credential from her bank to her, the credential from her employer to her bank. But she's doing that at the time of need and for her purposes. So it's under her control. It gives Alice a lot of autonomy. This is why we think of this as self-sovereign identity. Second thing that's really important is minimal disclosure. When Alice presents the credential to the bank, she's not actually presenting the credential, like I said. Instead, she's using a zero-knowledge proof to just present the information that the bank needs. So in my example, I said the bank needed to know Alice's salary and that she'd been employed for over 3 years. Using zero-knowledge proofs, Alice can present that, even though her employment credential might have much more information in it. It might be a very rich document. So practically speaking, right, the credential can be very rich and still protect privacy. I think it's important to understand that an identity metasystem rearranges how we think of things working online. Because an identity metasystem based on credentials supports ad hoc interaction without prior integrations and business arrangements, it's useful for the kind of flexible, spur-of-the-moment interactions that life is filled with. It means that we don't have to have an app for absolutely every workflow that we're trying to contemplate. And workflows are an important thing to think about. When can you use credentials? You can use a credential anytime you have a workflow that requires information to be exchanged between several parties. So when you're thinking about how would I use this system, imagine a workflow that matters to you. Think about the information that is exchanged in that workflow, and then build that information exchange as credentials. And the world is full of workflows, right? We've got lots of them. And credentials can enable all of them. This is all in production right now. I showed you the Connect Me app, right? The Connect Me wallet. That's available. There are also other wallets that are available. There's a wallet available from a company called Street Cred ID, and several more that I know are in beta. When I said earlier this is not a monolith, what I meant is exactly this idea. Multiple players can produce software that works in this system. There's no sovereign wallet that is the single wallet that everybody has to use. People are going to come up with different ideas. They're going to come up with different apps. They're going to integrate this into different systems. And through all of that, we're going to learn how this works. But you can issue credentials today. You can you can create a credential definition, start issuing credentials. You can have your users use those credentials for whatever workflow is important to you. So if that's interesting to you, we'd love to talk. I know Mike Lauder is going to be talking later about some of the details of this, so if you're a developer, definitely want to get in some of the details of what he's doing. But we would love to have as many people start using this as possible and start kicking the tires. So in conclusion, trustworthy credentials reorder how things work online. Specifically, I think trustworthy credentials have the power to bring about a true change in how we think about interacting online. Like I said earlier, digital identity is about remembering, recognizing, and interacting with people in some kind of trusted relationship. The kinds of things people do every day in the physical world are based on that happening in an easy, flexible, and sometimes ad hoc manner. A digital credentialing system, an identity meta system, allows those same kinds of interactions with the same ad hoc ease of use to happen online. That's why I think this is important. I think it's actually foundational to so many things that we're trying to do online. So this is my contact information. I blog at windley.com, and I have a lot of articles on Sovrin up there. I tweet at Windley. Happy to answer questions today at the conference. I'll be around. I'll be around tomorrow. Feel free to send me an email, connect with me on Twitter, respond on my blog. I'd love to hear from you and get your ideas about how all of this works. Thank you.
Thanks for your speech, Mr. Phillip Windley. Tekrar teşekkür ediyoruz sunumlarından dolayı Phillip Windley.